Hi everyone! This week I read the B.F. Skinner book about behaviorism, chapter 8, and it's titled Causes and Reasons. And of course, when I first read it, I instantly thought about cause and effect, and how you can do something and then this happens, and it just follows that pattern. So the beginning of the chapter focuses on the difference between commands, advice, and warnings. Skinner says that a command or warning is given to a person, so they would be the listener, and the person giving the command or warning is the speaker. A person can give a command or warning to another person in order to get them to do something that they want, but there's differences between commands and warnings. A command is when the speaker tells the person to do something, and if he or she chooses not to follow along or listen to the command, then the speaker gets to choose the consequence that goes along with it. With a warning, though, if you give a warning to somebody and they choose not to, it's out of your hands. You don't get to pick that control. You don't control the consequence. I instantly think into my classroom with a command. If I tell them to stop talking, or they lose a dojo point, that's my consequence, my own personal consequence. It's not stop talking or something's going to fall. It's something that I pick as the speaker. Giving a warning is different because the speaker is not the one who arranges the consequence that will happen. It's in the book he talks about a command could be move over or else, and then he says that a warning could be watch out, and then that describes an act or implies a consequence, such as an escape from a falling rock. So before I continue reading it, the minute I saw watch out, I thought about being on a sidewalk and stepping off and someone getting hit by a car. I can tell them to watch out, but if they don't heed my warning, then the natural consequence is something bad's going to happen. You could get hit by a car. Putting that in my own classroom, I have them organize their notebooks. It's my warning to them. If it's not, there's nothing I can do, but you're not going to do well on the quiz, because we do open notebook quizzes. The third one that Skinner talks about is advice, and advice in this case implies positive reinforcing consequences if the listener chooses to follow. So putting this into a classroom, if I have my students organize their notes and I give them that advice that I would date everything, highlight, and they take my advice, they're going to do really well on their quizzes and get good grades. So Skinner says that a person heeds warning and takes advice depending upon what has happened in similar circumstances in the past. So if I have somebody tell me something 4 or 5 times and I take their advice every time and it doesn't turn out right, I'm not going to listen to them anymore. But we know that with students, with behavior, we can give the same advice, but if different circumstances are happening, the student might be more likely to listen to us. The next section in this chapter is directions and instructions, and before I read this, I thought they were very similar. Directions, this is a quote from Skinner. He says that directions do not impart knowledge or convey information. They describe behavior that is to be executed and state or imply consequences. So direction is supposed to tell a student what is expected with their behavior and then give or imply what could happen if they don't follow those directions. Top of the page on all my stuff, I always have directions, but I never put an actual consequence. I didn't realize that directions, like Skinner says, should state or imply consequences. But I, again, took this as giving directions that were saying what's expected of a person. You walk in my classroom, I don't have directions, I have guidelines for our classroom rules. So I have what's expected, and if a student's not demonstrating behavior, it's not wanted, we can tell them to do something else in hopes that they'll change it, knowing that there's going to be a consequence. Another quote that I pulled from this section about instruction, it says, much of education is instruction in verbal behavior. And it said, I put that we tell our students what's expected and how to do something by telling them. Verbal behavior to me is just sharing and instructing the student in our rooms to do something, to not have a problem behavior arise. And if there is a problem behavior, we talk them down. We give them verbal cues and communication, and it's all by verbal behavior. The next section that I really found interesting is the laws of science. And in this section, it talks about how behaviors are shaped by natural contingencies versus behaviors that are generated by a rule. A natural contingency is just a consequence that happens without the manipulation of a person. So it's kind of like when you give a warning and somebody doesn't take your warning, a natural contingency is going to be a consequence that has nothing to do with me. I didn't manipulate it. I didn't choose it. Rules, on the other hand, are things that people can learn more quickly than the behavior that is shaped by contingencies. And this is because people can follow a rule and they learn how to do something more quickly than learning from a natural consequence, which I thought was really interesting. A rule is pretty cut and dry. 9 times out of 10, a person can follow the rule and accomplish a task because they know what's expected of them every step of the way. I know I teach 4th grade. I always have it listed out, the rules for what students have to do. And I do that in order to divert the students from having problem behaviors in my classroom because it's on the board what's expected. This is what they have to do. A person who is following directions and taking the advice that is being given or obeying the rules that have been presented, they don't always behave in the same way that a person who has experienced and been directly exposed to the natural contingencies. I believe that this is because the description of the contingency or natural consequence is never exact. They can do something once and they touch the stove and they burn their hand. But then the second time they do it and they hit the pan and everything flies. It could just be different every time. And then Skinner said that the contingency is usually simplified in order to be easily taught or understood. So I put this into my classroom and with the behaviors, and it should be things that our students understand easily. It shouldn't be something super complicated that they're going to not totally understand, and something that they can follow pretty easy. The next section that I talked about, I have notes on my computer, are reason and reasons. And he says that we often speak of the consequences of behavior as reasons. So behind every behavior is a reason why it happened, I believe. And that's how we talk about it. And reasons why we did something or why something happened. So again, my mind, cause, and effect. By thinking about why and how things happen, we're reasoning with ourselves and others. I try my hardest to talk to my kids and my students who have behaviors about why. Why did this happen? What did you do beforehand? What happened after? So what caused it? What effect did that have? And what reason behind it? And how can we reason with each other on figuring out how to keep it from happening again? And then I have that the behavior occurred for a reason, but we just need to know why. And when a person is able to understand the consequences that have happened, so a student who gets detention and they can understand why, then they're going to understand the reason, and hopefully that will help them look back on their behavior that caused that reaction and understand that this happened because X, Y, Z, and they understand to not do that again. I think that falls in with knowing our positive and negative reinforcers and circumstances and consequences. If a student is getting a positive reinforcement, they're going to know why, because they did something well, so they get this. So it has that balance of reasons, why, and how, and then that's just repeats, so they can keep getting those positive reinforcers because they like that, versus the negative consequences such as detention or going to the principal's office or something worse. I think about students being able to understand why something happened and their behaviors. I relate that to my classroom. I teach 4th grade, so my students are 9 and 10 years old, so they understand sometimes if they do this, this is going to happen, and that's why this happens. My husband, who teaches 1st grade and his kids are 6, don't always understand the reason behind why something happens because they're not there yet. They haven't experienced a lot of natural contingencies and consequences that happen, and they haven't been exposed to reasoning why something happens. Another part that I thought was really interesting in this chapter is that it talks about impulse and deliberation. And he has in here a quote from Thomas Hobbes. It says, "I conceive that when a man deliberates whether he shall do a thing or not, he does nothing else but consider whether it be for himself to do it or not." So I think that we should look at each other, and we understand that we are sometimes selfish and we only think about ourselves when we're doing something, and it's not always a student's fault. If they're acting out, they might only be thinking of themselves and not the people around them. So we need to remember that in that moment, they're only thinking of themselves. I think my discussion question is, the question that I have to pose is, what we know about behavior and that some students have impulse behaviors and they may not quite understand the reasons why they do something. Is it still fair to give them the same consequence if they are not aware of why something is happening? Thank you.